Hi, I'm Rick Brimacombe, and on behalf of the Minneapolis Club and my firm, Brimacombe Capital, welcome to Club E. Our discussion today is a success story to inspire. Again, Rick Buchholz, the CFO of Inspire Medical Systems, will be our speaker. For those of you who want a quick look at the stock price, the ticker symbol is INSP. And of course, Rick won't be talking about things he wouldn't or shouldn't talk about. But I, however, can comment, which is the stock has more than doubled since it went public about a year and a half ago. And the market cap is doing great. And it's a wonderful story. John and I belong to a investment club that we heard their story a handful of months ago, and I knew right then and there that I wanted him to share his story with the Club E universe. A lot of layers of interest here that I wanted to share with everybody. For those of you who haven't been here before, I've been doing Club E for 13 years now. I appreciate your ongoing support and for making this group an important habit of your business life for those of you who come regularly. On the multiple layers of interest from the Inspire story, started as a Medtronic spinout, which by itself is interesting, and then they raised multiple rounds of private capital, which again by itself is interesting, and then they went public and did a follow-on financing. So there's multiple chapters to this story that you're going to hear about today. It's a great story to learn from and also provide a powerful motivational message for you, and hopefully there'll be some nuggets that you can take with you going forward with your various businesses and opportunities you're involved in. Before we get to Rick's talk, I'd like to thank our Club E sponsors. Irish Titan is an e-commerce and strategic digital agency. Boulay CPAs and Business Advisors. Highland Bank, a local family-owned community bank. Winthrop and Weinstein, a general practice law firm. Minnesota Sales Institute. Scott Plum and their company works with leadership and sales teams to grow revenue. And then the Network Connect, I'm partners with Dick Summerstead off to my right. Up in front, Network Connect is a catalytic gateway for connecting investors, service providers, and companies. For those of you who get signed up at least 24 hours in advance, there's a little bit of discount for doing that. They do shut down, as some of you found out, the online registration at 24 hours in advance. Good to get signed up early if you can. Generally speaking, it's the first Thursday of the month. The website clube.com allows you to sign up for emails and newsletter for future events if that would be of interest to you. There's also a business directory for members. LinkedIn group Club E/Minneapolis has about 2,700 members. Meetup group's got about 2,000. And then, as I said, we got our email list. Minneapolis Club has partnered with me on this from day one. Chum Struve is in the back to my right. Chum runs the St. Paul group, which is at the University Club in St. Paul, but here in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Club's been a wonderful partner of mine, been a great addition to my life, both personally and professionally. If anybody wanted to learn about the Minneapolis Club, you can see me afterwards on that. One of the things that I do with Dick Summerstead of the Network Connect is Lessons from the Garage. We have a series of video podcasts with over 200 titles, and we'll probably be pushing over 300 in the not-too-distant future. Kind of like Netflix for business owners and entrepreneurs, people trying to grow their companies. So you can see Dick Summerstead about that, or myself. As far as future events go, if you're dying to learn more about e-commerce, the reason there's nobody from Irish Titan here today is Irish Titan is running their 5th annual e-com forum at the Machine Shop, and it's afternoon and into the evening talking about e-commerce stuff. So anybody who didn't get their fill at lunch today or wants to brush up on e-commerce stuff, you can head over to the Machine Shop. Next Thursday, a week from today, is the 3rd annual Owners Forum, which is co-sponsored by Club E and the Exit Planning Institute, who I did a joint event with last month. And the Owners Forum is what it says. It's for owners, by owners. That's a good event a week from now if anybody has an interest in that. I mentioned Chum Struve and the Club E St. Paul group. Navigating the Whitewater of Change is her lunch on October 16th. And then I just started in September, group in Maple Grove, and they'll be meeting on October 24th. If somebody wants to learn more about Maple Grove, see me out. And then at the end of the month, Exit Strategies is here in Minneapolis, October 30th. And then two quick things about Club E. Looking forward into November and December. In November, we're talking about ESOPs on November 8th. ESOPs came up a couple of times over the last couple of months, so we're going to do a session just on ESOPs for those of you interested in that. And just a heads up, that got moved to a Friday, which is very unusual for my lunch thing, but don't show up on Thursday, November 7th. That won't be good. So that's November 8th. And then December 5th, I have the folks from Distill Advisory Firm talking about consumer trends and try to tackle some sort of retailing thing in December to talk about what's going on from a consumer standpoint and all the shopping that we'll all be doing over the holiday season. So those are the announcements, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and a successful business person, Rick Buchholz, who's CFO of Inspire Medical Systems. And interesting thing about Rick, we originally crossed paths when I was at Sherpa Partners, and Rick was much earlier in his finance and accounting days, and so I've known him for a lot of years. You're going to hear a wonderful story from a great man, and welcome, Rick Buchholz.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm really happy to be here. I am a cheesehead, but I have been working in the Minneapolis marketplace for 29 years since I got out of school at Eau Claire. So I'm a Timberwolves fan, I'm a Wild fan, and I'm a Twins fan, but I just can't shake the Packers. So apologize about that. But I'm happy to be here. So I just want to give you a little background on Inspire Medical Systems, kind of the history of the company. It's a great story. It actually started back in 1998. But it's pretty remarkable on what our founder, Tim Herbert, has done over the last couple decades. So we just did some rebranding. We operate in the obstructive sleep apnea market, OSA. So for those people that wear a mask, people that cannot tolerate a CPAP mask, another alternative is Inspire, and I'll talk about that briefly. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but we are a neurostimulation device for sleep apnea, as I mentioned, and we're the first and only FDA-approved device that's been on the market. We got approved about 5 years ago in 2014, and again, I'll go through the history on that, but the obstructive sleep apnea space is about a $10 billion annual market opportunity. And you may sit there and say, well, that's not believable, but it is. There's some details that I'll talk about in a bit. So we've treated more than 6,000 patients since inception, and the number of patients to get from 0 to 1,000 and then from 5,000 to 6,000 has dramatically been reduced, and so we continue to grow and commercialize our business. So just a little bit of background. I joined the company about 5.5 years ago. I started my career just a block away in Pillsbury Center at Ernst & Young, so I'm a CPA by training. I was there for about 7 years, and then I joined Howard Root at Vascular Solutions back in the day. I was there. I was the 13th employee, I believe. We did a couple private rounds of financing. And then I was there for the IPO. I was not the CFO at the time, but I cut my teeth in doing a transaction. I learned a lot going through the 2 private rounds and then the IPO. Jerry Johnson, some of you may have known him. Jerry came in and really did the IPO back in 2000, back around 2000. Jerry left, and then I became CFO shortly thereafter. And then I actually left Vascular Solutions back in 2001, and I had a consulting business where I provided contract CFO services to medical device companies. And then I joined Dan Sullivan, who's a local entrepreneur, and I worked at a company called Super Dimension, and we grew that from 2006 to 2012. and we ultimately sold that business to Covidien. And the reason why I'm telling you this is, so our largest investor at Super Dimension before we sold to Covidien was a hedge fund out of New York called OrbiMed Advisors. And so I agreed to stay on for a year after the acquisition. And then I was looking for my next venture, and our largest shareholder was OrbiMed. OrbiMed, coincidentally, was leading Tim's Series E round of financing. And so I got introduced to Tim through a hedge fund in New York. So it was great. So I knew nothing about Inspire, got introduced through a bank in New York, and then I joined right about the time we were commercializing. So Tim on the left is our president, CEO, and founder, and I'll go into more detail on Tim's background, but he's an engineer by training and was working at Medtronic when this technology was spun out of the company. Randy Ban, who's our chief commercial officer, a lot of experience. He actually is like employee 10, has been with the company for 10 years, but the ironic thing is Randy is a sales guy who was at Guidant for years and then Boston Scientific, but Tim brought Randy in when we were about 6 years or so before we got approval, before commercialization. And so Tim had the foresight to bring Randy in to learn the market, help with the clinical trial, enrollment, and so looking back is a brilliant move. And so there's been a couple other companies who have been bringing sales and marketing people into the organization on an earlier basis than just right upon commercialization to get to know the business. So briefly, obstructive sleep apnea is a physiological collapse of the airway. And so the measurement of your severity of obstructive sleep apnea is your AHI, apnea hypnot index, and it's AHI, a number of events that your throat closes on an hourly basis. So we treat moderate to severe sleep apnea. So those patients that have 15 or more closures on an hourly basis, those are the patients that we can go after. And so there are millions of those patients that are out there. There's roughly 24 million Americans that have, in the U.S., that have moderate to severe sleep apnea. So it's a very big market. And what's gaining more and more understanding, you can't really see the chart, but in the lower right here, there was a 20-year study done by a professor down in Madison, actually, and followed a small town in Wisconsin. And after 15 years, those patients that had severe sleep apnea, their mortality rate was about 60%. So clearly the comorbidities of increased risk of heart attack, stroke is very prolific with people that have severe sleep apnea. Our market is large. You can read this chart, but at the end of the day, there's 2 million CPAP machines prescribed on an annual basis. And studies have shown, on average, there's about 50% of the people use them after 6 to 9 months. And so CPAP works for some people, but about half of those patients, it does not work well. You're tethered to your nightstand with a hose. You have air blowing down your throat. If you have really severe sleep apnea, you have to crank up the volume, if you will, and blow more air down your throat. And it's very uncomfortable. You have dry mouth. And when we did our clinical study, 30% of the people in our study, when it started, slept in a different bedroom than their bed partner. At the end of the 12 months, that came down to about 5%, and we talk about we don't know, we can't help that other 5%. So, but if you look at breaking down, there's the patients that are right for our procedure. You have to have tried CPAP and failed. That's who are the patients that we are going after. And if you have the right anatomy, and we filter out about 30% of those patients for anatomy, you boil that down, there's 500,000 patients that are presented on an annual basis that are good candidates for our device. Our device, our average selling price is roughly $23,000. That's where we get to a $10 billion market opportunity. So, again, CPAP, here's the gold standard. And here's our device here on the left. We have 4 components. 3 of the components are implanted, and then you have a remote that you turn the device on and off with on a nightly basis. So on the right, you can see there's a implantable pulse generator, an IPG, that gets implanted right below your right clavicle. We leave the left side for any cardiology for pacemakers or defibs. So on the right side, and essentially there is a small lead that goes up, is tunneled under your skin, and goes around your hypoglossal nerve. And your hypoglossal nerve controls the motion of your tongue. So CPAP blows air down your throat to keep the airway open. What we do is we stimulate that nerve that controls your tongue, and we just gently, rhythmically, just stimulate that nerve, and it pushes the tongue forward, and it opens up the airway. And it works really well. And we have a sensing lead too. So every breath we sense, and as soon as we sense the breathing, we stimulate, and it pushes the tongue forward. And it just works very well. We have 94% patient satisfaction over the long term. And what's really nice is you're not tethered to your bed. There's not air blowing down your throat. You have a remote. You turn it on and off, and in the morning, and if you forget to turn it off, it times out. And that battery is good for 11 years with no recharging. There's some people that have other devices for pain or epilepsy. You have to recharge those devices. Our device is 11-year battery life with no recharging, which is a really good feature. So I'll take you back in time a little bit. This is, I didn't tell Tim I was putting this picture up there, but he'll really appreciate this. So this is Tim in 2007 when he's working on the Series A round of financing. So not sure if you can read this, but just to give you a little story about the history of Inspire. So Tim is an engineer by training, working in the Reagan years, as he says, in defense. When a lot of the defense contractors and engineer in the business went a little bit south for back in the 80s, a lot of the engineers gravitated to about the same time Medtronic started up and so on. And so Tim was an engineer, and he was working at Medtronic. He worked for the Corporate Ventures Group. So his job was to go around Medtronic and look at all the different applications where you could use neurostimulation, but not the heart. So he worked on gastric bypass, he worked on pain, he worked on epilepsy, all the different applications for neurostimulation. And the prized possession, in his view, was this technology for sleep apnea. And so back in 1998, they did 5 patients, and they had good results. It was very early in 1998. And then in 2001, Art Collins, who was CEO of Medtronic, he shut down the corporate ventures arm of Medtronic and said, okay, all these projects, they need to go out to the business units to be funded. And so Tim went to one of the business units, and he went to 3 different business units, and they said, we can't afford to spend $20, $30 million on a multi-year, multi-center clinical study, so you're out of luck. And so corporate would not fund Inspire. It was even called Inspire back then too. And so Tim went on to work on different areas within Medtronic, within corporate ventures, but he always had this sitting in his office in a bunch of banker boxes, the patents, and he even says when you open the box, it said, he had instructions that said start here, basically to restart the project. And so he worked on this for about 4 or 5 years trying to get it out of Medtronic was unsuccessful. And then when there was a change in CEOs, Bill Hawkins took over for Art Collins. Tim really pressed Hawkins, and he eventually spun out the technology into a separate, complete individual entity in 2007. So what Tim did is, the first thing he did is he spun out the technology, and I'll go about the rights and why Medtronic did this, but the first thing he did once he spun it out, he went to his boss, and who was running corporate ventures was a former vice chair, Dr. Glenn Nelson, and that was really Tim's mentor, Dr. Nelson. He went to Dr. Nelson and said, hey, here's what I'm doing, here's my plan, And Dr. Nelson said, this deserves a chance. So he wrote him a check for $250,000. And so that was in the beginning of 2007. And he said, this deserves a chance. Good luck. So Tim said, all right, I'm going to go raise some money and just start the new venture. And he met with Ed Schuck. I don't know if any of you guys know Ed Schuck. He passed away. So did Dr. Nelson, which I'll talk about that too. But he said, I'm going to go raise some Series A financing. Take me a couple months, and I'll start doing clinical trials. And Ed said, Ed actually was the CEO of EdenTech, I believe, back in the day. And he was a very well-known individual for sleep studies and home sleep testing. And Ed said, okay, good luck. And then Tim professes that 9 months later, Ed called him back and said, how's it going? He said, well, let's have breakfast again. And so he needed a little bit of help. So Tim talks about the fact that he got the $250,000, didn't take a paycheck because he didn't know how long it was going to last him. And then ultimately he got introduced to U.S. Venture Partners and Kleiner Perkins through Dr. Nelson. And he went through and said, here's our plan. Here's the initial studies that we're going to do for the clinical trials. And they actually seeded the company for a $5 million round of financing. So the ironic thing is when he did the Series A financing, Medtronic came back and invested and participated in their round of financing. So they let the technology spin out, but they actually came in and invested in the Series A of financing. And then we did another 5 round of financing, and Medtronic invested in every round thereafter. So fast forward, now that we talk to investors a lot, the question we get all the time is, why, if this is such great technology, it's much easier to answer now, but back in the day when Tim was doing Series A, B, and C, if this is such great technology, why would Medtronic ever allow this core technology to leave its roof? And it really came down to, at the time, Medtronic was so focused on earnings per share and not investing a lot in R&D at the time that they allowed this technology to leave. They did agree. They had a right of first refusal. That expired 2 years after we commercialized. So that's expired. They initially got around 15% of the company. They participated in rounds of financing, but it got diluted down. And they currently have around just under 3% of the company now, and even less when you count fully diluted shares. So they still have some shares, but they're very insignificant. There's no board spot. They had the right of first refusal. But the one thing that was helpful is when we were developing our clinical trials, they agreed to manufacture our initial device for 2 or 3 years after we got approval as well, which has since expired, and we use another company to do our manufacturing now. But it was very easy, not easy, but during the regulatory process, when you talk about your vendors and you have Medtronic as a vendor who's manufacturing your device, that doesn't hurt during the regulatory process. So Tim was successful in doing the Series A, and then during this whole time, he was told no a lot, but he had a lot of persistence, and he just kept plowing away, hitting milestones, and so he was ultimately able to raise future rounds of financing. You can see that in 2009 he got a $16 million Series B round of financing, and that funded the multi-year clinical study. And so the company has been very focused. I joined back in 2014 when we did the Series E round of financing, but looking back on all the milestones that Tim achieved, it's pretty remarkable looking back that he said, okay, with this round of financing, we're going to get through our enrollment. He did. He got another round of financing. Our next round of financing, we need to get to commercialization, and he was successful in doing that. And so just, you hear it all the time, but just doing what you say you're going to do and actually pulling it off is extraordinarily helpful in the financing round. And so that's really, when you do a startup, that's exactly what you need to do. and even more so when you're in the public markets too. You try and deliver those results, and you just got to be realistic on what you can do. And so when you're early in the process, I think transparency is important too. And from the time the company was started until almost our IPO, we would actually have a in-person board meeting on a quarterly basis, and then we would have a 1.5 hour phone call every month, a board update. And it's just keeping the board engaged was very helpful. And so they're along with you for the entire ride. So they're instead of just once a quarter having a board meeting, we would keep them almost too much information. But it was a very good approach that Tim took from day one. So I'm trying to think of some other stories I can tell from this timetable. I have to see what my next slide is. All right, so a theme that you'll see if you go to our office, when I talked about positive attitude and persistence, Tim has this book, The Little Engine That Could, in his office, and he's had it in his office since he started the company. And one of our researchers, Quan Ni, is from China, and he worked at Guidant. And he came and interviewed with Tim. I think he was a 4th employee, and he had the book on his desk. Tim did. And Quan had no idea what this book is about. And Tim's like, Quan, here you go. Read this book. Come back for your second interview. And so that's really been. We have a poster. We have some trains in our office. But Tim always talks about positive thinking and persistence, and that's a little engine that could, and that resonates throughout our company. When I joined, we had about 45 employees. Now we're up to about 230 employees, and every employee that joins the company gets a copy of the Little Engine That Could book, and it was pretty special. So the day we went public, we rung the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, which was fabulous. Tim and I were on the road for about 2-3 weeks on the road show, and then we got back to the road show, back from the road show on the road on Wednesday night, and we priced our deal, and we came back to the hotel, and our families were waiting for us. It was great. And then the next day we went and we opened the stock market, which I can talk about that. And then that evening we had a big party. We had a dinner, and that night at dinner, Tim's 3 adult children presented him with a first edition copy of The Little Engine That Could. So it was pretty cool. It was a very emotional, but it was very touching. And so we still talk about this book constantly. So here is it's really a life's work for Tim. I mean, he started working on this in 1998. So fast forward 30 years. No. 20 years. Thank you. I have people that do math for me now. I'm kidding. But 20 years. But 20 years that he's been working on this project, and it really culminated in the fact that when he rang the bell at the stock exchange, and you'll see on his left up there is his wife Margie, and on the right is Miss Marilyn Nelson, and so Dr. Nelson, who funded this initially, passed away, and then shortly after he passed away, Tim scheduled a meeting with Marilyn to talk to her about board position, and Marilyn thought Tim was approaching her to find potential candidates to be on the board, to be a chairperson, and Tim said, "No, Marilyn, we want you to be our chairperson. Dr. Nelson would have liked this. She's obviously a very accomplished person that you know. She's been on the Super Bowl committee. She's been on the board of ExxonMobil. She ran her Carlson family company for years and years and years, and so it was great. And so this was the first time, I mean, in her storied career that she actually was at the New York Stock Exchange to ring the bell. So she was tickled pink that day to be able to do that and to do it with us. And the rest of the people, there's only 14 spots on the New York Stock Exchange when you ring the bell, and so a lot of times it's VCs who end up being on the board, the initial investors who are on the board with the CEOs. But Tim said, I don't want to do that. I want to allow the first people that were in the company, so the initial people, that initial employees who have been with the company the longest, are up on the podium, along with myself and Tim and his wife and Marilyn. And then we have one on the back left, one representative from our board of directors who was up there. So it was a great experience. So just briefly on a couple other points. So when we went public, we were getting approvals and growing our revenue through prior authorization. And so it was amazing when we were going through the due diligence for the IPO, how much the bankers and others would look back at our historical internal forecasts and then compare what we actually said we were going to do in our forecast to what we actually achieved. And we always beat our numbers, and so we prided ourselves a lot on that. And so during the IPO process, a lot of people had initial hesitation because they're like, you're not going to be able to grow your revenue like the street thinks you can grow because you don't have coverage policies. And so part of the success that we had was when we went public in May of 18, we had 3 million covered lives. And now fast forward, shortly after we went public, we got Aetna, that's 22 million covered lives. And then we got Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is another several million covered lives. And then recently in August, we got United Healthcare. And as Tim says, I've been throwing eggs at that building for years to get them to write coverage for us, but we finally got them. And so as we sit here today, we're at 142 million covered lives, and we have about 60 million to go. And so that allowed us to put forth additional milestone achievements after we went public. And so we continue to work on that. And we actually, Mike McKee from Baker here, one of his colleagues from New York, they have a market access or reimbursement group in New York, and they were very helpful in us securing a lot of these coverage policies. I thought Baker Tilly was an accounting firm, but they have a special department out in New York that works on reimbursement. It was very helpful for us. In addition, how am I doing on time? I'm okay. In addition to treating all the patients that have obstructive sleep apnea, we are now looking at another indication that we're working on. We don't have approval for this yet, but right now we have adult patients are with obstructive sleep apnea, but there's a significant number of Down syndrome pediatrics, ages 12, even from 12 to 22, that have obstructive sleep apnea. Just from the fact of their anatomy, it's very prolific with Down syndrome kids, and so we've actually implanted around 30 pediatric kids with Down syndrome. We're working on this for FDA approval, so it will add to our already existing large market. But this kind of hits home for you when you see the story. I'll show you on doing why what we're doing, the why of what we're doing. So I'll let you watch this.
16-year-old Jesse Rivera is just like most teenage boys. He loves dancing to YouTube videos. He enjoys playing with the family dog, and he loves swimming with his family. But his parents say life wasn't always so carefree.
Night times, they were really hard. It was a challenge sleeping. We always had to have somebody in the house or in the room with him. We had rotating nurses constantly and lots of restless nights.
Jesse was born with Down syndrome, complicated by tracheomalacia, a rare disease that left his trachea underdeveloped and floppy, resulting in countless trips to the emergency room and the pediatric intensive care unit. As Jesse aged, he also developed severe obstructive sleep apnea, further complicating his young life.
Shortly after his birth, I placed a tracheostomy because he couldn't breathe, and then he had issues from a floppy airway to the big tongues the kids with Down syndrome get, and to the frustrations of trying to wear a CPAP mask for children with Downs who have sensory integration issues. Adults have trouble with the mask, so imagine a child trying to wear the mask, and now imagine a child with
complicated challenges of living with the trach also prevented him from living the life his parents wanted for him.
He used to spend hours in front of the computer, hours, looking at kids going down water slides. And all he could do is go to a pool and put his feet in.
In early 2014, Dr. Hartnick told Jessica and Santo about Inspire, a revolutionary implantable device to help Jesse's sleep apnea, and so much more.
Since forever, we have been talking about, there will be a new technology on the horizon that may come and will come because you want to give hope that will allow this trach to come out. Reading the STAR trial in the New England Journal was kind of the light bulb that said, this might be it.
Jesse was implanted in April of that year as the first patient in Inspire's pediatric Down syndrome study. Dr. Hartnick was able to plug the trach for good, and when Inspire therapy was eventually turned on, the family realized the answer to their prayers.
Well, I remember it was on my birthday, and I just remember watching him, like you watch a newborn breathing, and I was like, he's breathing. And you can see the sats, like, his sat level, maintaining at a good level, and he's sleeping soundly. It was pretty awesome. So the Inspire people, everyone out there who had hands-on the technology that has literally given my son a second chance at a better life, I'd like to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for your brains, thank you for your hands, thank you for whatever pushed you guys to create this little device that changed a little boy's life. Just thank you, and it's like the best creation that you guys have created for my son, and I thank you very much. God bless everybody. Thank you.
That's pretty cool. That's cool. So I'll give you a little more background too. So a little different than the traditional medical device companies that I've worked with in the past. We have a significant direct-to-patient channel because every time we talk about sleep apnea, people talk about it. You sit around the campfire and talk about sleep apnea or you're snoring and so on. So what we do is we go into markets and then we turn on radio spots and then drive those potential patients to our website. And then we think about 60 to 70% of our referrals end up coming through our direct-to-patient initiatives, and the rest come through the traditional doctor referrals because we're very early stage. We're in 245 centers in the U.S. right now, and we think we could be in over 1,000 and more longer term. And so we're just early in the curve. We have 59 sales representatives throughout the country. We think ultimately we'll have several hundred sales reps. So we're still early just because we have not gotten out there. So we're still getting the word out there. So we have to spend money in direct-to-patient to get them out there. But you can see the first half of the year, we had 2 million people visit our website. We're getting thousands of people hitting our website weekly. And then we had 21,000, what was it, 21? Yeah, 21,000 doctor contacts in the first half of the year, meaning people interested, checking out our technology, seeing if it's a good fit for them. Last year, we did just under 51 million in revenue, and we treated about just over 2,000 patients. So with our ASP, so it's a law of large numbers, and so we're going to continue to spend radio dollars. And recently, because we're starting to get a few more installed centers, we're starting to do a little bit of TV. We're doing TV in 3 markets: Kansas City, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, as a kind of a test market. But ultimately, we'll be there more. So I like these commercials. So I'm going to share them. They're brief, and then I'll move on. I think it kind of looks like it looks like Netflix almost when you see the setting on this, but it's pretty. We even had to rent a house to do the commercial. It's crazy.
I have sleep apnea. Couldn't use CPAP. Now I have this. This is Inspire. It's simple. It's just a button.
Sometimes I press this button.
Inspire is a sleep apnea treatment that works inside my body with a click of this remote.
No no hose, just sleep.
We go night-night.
And
Inspire, sleep apnea innovation. Learn more at inspiresleep.com.
I remember when our marketing, so because we're doing some non-traditional medical device marketing, we actually hired one of the marketing leads from General Mills who doesn't have any medical device experience. And so he's bringing a lot of those things. The Fiber One bars, he was really responsible for that and some other initiatives back with General Mills. And so when he brought this I remember sitting in Tim's office when he first showed the commercial. Tim's like, absolutely not. But we're just doing a test market for it now. So
I have an announcement. I'm sleeping with Inspire.
Inspire? What about Mom?
I'm into it.
Into what?
Inspire is a sleep apnea treatment.
It works inside my body with the click of this button. No mask, no hose.
No mask, no hose.
Just sleep with the click of this button.
Things are going to be different around here. Inspire, sleep apnea innovation. You can sleep with Inspire too. Learn more at inspiresleep.com.
So I don't really have many more slides, but this is kind of what we've been doing is we're in a large market opportunity. We don't have any competition for implantable devices for the next 3 to 4 years, and so it's really our market to grow. And so we're being really methodical. We're adding 4 to 5 territory managers on a quarterly basis. We're adding 12 to 14 new centers on a quarterly basis. And we're trying to maintain really pristine outcomes. And that goes back to when Tim was starting this with Dr. Nelson. Patient outcomes, keep them high, keep them good, and then the rest will kind of take care of itself. Earl Bakken used to preach that at Medtronic back in the early days. And so because we don't have any competition in a large market, we're just really trying to maintain those pristine outcomes while still having good sustainable growth that Wall Street likes to see. But that's really kind of the balancing act that we're going through right now. So I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but what I would say is back when we were privately held, we had meetings and meetings and meetings, and we were told no a lot, and it was just that positive attitude and persistence and the transparency that Tim always uses, and just kind of doing what you say you're going to do in your executive summary and your business plan. I'm a bean counter, so when I look at some startup companies and I see a financial forecast and they all have 100 million by year 3, things take a little bit longer than you see. And so you can kind of shoot holes in those. But I think if you're forthright and transparent, and even though the milestone is not what you want it to be, if you can still achieve it, I think that helps to get that next round of financing. And it does take a while, but the persistence pays off. So I don't know if I have any more. This is just a look back. Because I'm a CFO, I have to throw these slides in here. But this is our growth. We started in 2014, and we did $4 million our first year, and then $8 million, and then 16, and we're continuing to grow. And the denominator on your growth keeps getting higher and higher and more difficult, but so far so good. So that's all I have for my prepared remarks. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions. Oh. Thanks.
For your target patient population, what percentage are men versus women?
So in our clinical study, the average age, for age-wise, was 53 years old in our study. That's why commercial insurance is important to us, because it's more of a younger person's disease. And we've also, in some recent studies, we think that average age will probably come down a little bit. But it was about, in one of our studies, it was about 58, 60% men versus women. So it's amazing, excuse me, but so golf trip, fishing trip with the guys is you snore and you hear somebody with sleep apnea, and it's like, you're stopped breathing, you need to go get a sleep study. And so I always make sure I carry business cards with me if I go on these trips. But it's also very serious because if every time you cut the air off and you stop breathing, every hour, every night, over the years, the comorbidities are not good. And so you're just depriving your brain of oxygen when you do that. And so, but like I said, people talk about sleep apnea, unlike other diseases.
How did you decide to IPO when you did?
Yeah. So we did a commercialization round, and then we were going after another round of financing, our Series F, and we were gaining some traction. And when we decided to go public, there hadn't been a true medical device IPO for about 12 months. And we got a couple small insurance coverage policies, but we had a 12-person prior authorization team, and we were getting approvals. And what we told people is, we already have insurance coverage. It just takes 6 months to get it approved through the prior authorization process. And we were able to educate the investors that we have approval. Right now it takes 6 months. For back before United Healthcare would approve, before they wrote coverage, they would approve in about 6 months. Now they approve in 2 to 5 days. And so we were able to show some revenue ramp through the prior authorization process. And we were on the cusp of maybe doing a private round, another crossover round. And we just said, we're going to put our head down. We're not going to run a dual path. We're going to go public. Because a lot of companies run a dual path. And I think that's dangerous because if you run a dual path, you need to, if the acquisition doesn't occur, you got to be ready to go public. And so it's different mindsets, in my opinion. And so we decided, and we were very fortunate. We did the roadshow. We did testing the waters. The investors liked the story, came back during the roadshow, and they continued to like the story. We had a really high 17 or 15 times oversubscribed book, and people got the story. And then shortly after we went public, we got Aetna. And so people said, oh, these guys actually got coverage. They said they're going to get coverage. We never gave them a time frame. We said it would be 12 to 18 months, but we ultimately got it much faster than we anticipated. So it's tough because those private rounds, we had one investor gave us a term sheet. We went to the board and we said, okay, I'm going to the board. We got a term sheet. This is good to go, right? Yes. And then told the board, and then the next week they pulled their term sheet. And so we had to go back to our second choice and ask for the round. And she says, we'd love to do the round, but this is going to cost you. So they actually cut from her original offer. She cut back the valuation of the company about 10%, 15%, because she knew the first player, she was number 2, and the first player backed away. So I think you need to talk to everybody, get as many term sheets as you can, and then make a decision. So.
Where are you on this becoming first-line treatment versus having to fail CPAP?
Yeah, we always thank ResMed and the fact that they bring 2 million people to CPAP on an annual basis, knowing that half of them are not going to use it. So they do a lot of marketing and a lot of awareness of CPAP. Ultimately, long term, we could maybe be a first line of defense, but we think being a second line defense that you had to use CPAP and then failed before you can get our device actually helped us during insurance. Because if we didn't have that, we'd go to an insurance company and they're like, well, no, we're not going to approve this because use CPAP, keep trying to use CPAP. And then we say they can't use it. They're intolerable. So we think it was helpful. And there's so many patients out there. Again, 500,000, and we treated just over 2,000 in 2018. So there's a lot of patients out there.
When a patient presses the button and they're asleep and have a fallen sleep practice, what are they feeling in the back of their time? Do they sense?
Yeah, the hypoglossal nerve is a motor nerve, not a sensory nerve. And so they don't really feel anything. So when you turn it on initially, your tongue goes like this just to let you know that it's on. And then you can customize it, but 70% of our people go with factory settings, if you will. And you turn it on, you know it's on, and then it takes about a 30 minutes delay to allow yourself to fall asleep. And you can have that delay set longer. But really what you feel is an involuntary movement of your tongue, but you don't have it on when you're awake. So you don't have it on when you're trying to talk. I mean, you only use it at night. That's why we get 11-year battery life, because it's only on at night, and it's direct nerve stimulation. So in the early days, some people say, well, it gives you some micro arousals, which wake you up, but that was back in 2001. So patients love it. So. Well, actually, the early IP has actually already been expired. A lot of that. We're adding a lot of patents and other IP around where we're going. We're going to do more interactive. We're creating the Inspire app that will be Bluetooth to the remote, so you can daily see your results on a daily basis. We're working on that now. It's going to come out in 2020, and so we're building a lot of IP around that. But a lot of the early on technology, a lot of the IP's already been expired. But the biggest moat, if you will, around our business is the fact that it's a PMA pivotal study versus a 510K. So it's 1 year for enrollment, 1 year follow-up, 1 year for the FDA to review and get back to you. So that's a minimum of 3 years if you started right now. We're not aware of any of the big companies working on this technology. So if all goes well, right now is 3 years, and we know there's 2 companies that are out there working on this. One is the Livanova. They bought Cyberonics. They're working on it, but they've said in their last quarterly call that they've delayed the project, so that's delayed. Then there's another one called Nexoa. They have an external power source, so they use an implant here, but then at night you have this external battery that you put below your chin, so you still have something external that's generating the power, and they're even further behind the first company. So that's why we're saying 3 to 4 years, and investors like to hear that. So. All right, so again, we have the room as long as folks would like to stay, but let's thank Rick. Thank you. Thanks.